State and local governments, ever since the Supreme Court's 1963 ruling in Gideon v. Wainwright, are required to provide effective legal representation. But that landmark decision only applied to criminal cases, and today, many activists are pushing for a civil Gideon, which would give the right to counsel in high-stakes, non-criminal legal proceedings, like housing eviction proceedings, child custody hearings, and civil domestic violent disputes. Advocates say it's a matter of civil rights. Opponents say it would be far too costly.
Well, Mayor de Blasio and City Council Speaker Melissa Mark Viverito are on the record as supporting what's called the Right to Counsel Bill, guaranteeing representation for low-income tenants who face eviction in housing court. And the bill has 36 co-sponsors. Here to tell us more about the issue and the specific bill in question are Kate Pastor. She's a freelance journalist who's covering the issue in a recent series of articles for City Limits, one of our favorites. Thanks for joining us, Kate.
Thank you.
And Randy Dillars from CASA Power. CASA stands for Community Action for Safe Apartments. Welcome, sir.
Thank you.
And Peter Johnson from the Pratt Area Community Council. Thanks for being here, Peter.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, welcome all. Thank you so much. Can we get right into it? You've been covering the story right from the beginning. Can you tell us what is the Right to Counsel Bill?
So this is a piece of legislation that was introduced in the council last year, and it basically provides the right for low-income tenants to have an attorney. So it would pay for attorneys for certain individuals who are facing eviction. So there are some specifics about what it covers and what it does not. But it would effectively allow many more tenants who are in housing court to appear with an actual attorney.
So, Peter and Randy, from your side, you guys are at the grassroots level when people are facing eviction. At some point along the spectrum, probably often too late, they call you guys. So how real a problem is the phone ringing and saying, you know what, I got the notice and it's been a few months, they're about to kick me out of my house?
Well, I think that it's very serious. One of the issues that we find is that the people are not necessarily aware of their rights. Right. As tenants. So they go down, they don't have great legal representation. Mm-hmm. They don't know that they can work out things with the other side, so with the landlord's attorneys, or to work out some sort of deal so that they could work in their apartments. And very often what's happening is that they're being these things are being driven so that they could get the tenants out of the apartments. More specifically, tenants who have been in those apartments for a long period of time.
Right. Okay, so basically we're talking about the housing environment in stock. Can you tell us a little bit about, specifically what housing court is like?
Okay, I can elaborate on that. As being an advocate, and also I faced eviction. I was in housing court for over 3 years. And if I didn't have an attorney, I would be in a shelter today. I learned what stipulations was. I didn't know that going in. I needed an attorney for that. When you go in and you have a default, that means you don't show up for court, then that means the case is thrown out. My attorney's landlord's attorney showed up for default twice, but he was able to write up a proposal to get the case put back on. By me not having representation, and if I didn't show up, I would be in the shelter today. It had been over with. So that's one of the reasons why we're fighting for tenants to have the right to have counseling, because once, if you're telling me if I owe you $5,000 and I can't pay that $5,000, but I'm signing a stipulation to say that I'm paying that, that's a binding contract. And so when I go in front of the judge, if I don't have that $5,000, they would evict me. Right. So I don't know without a lawyer that I'm not supposed to sign it or make that agreement.
Yeah. So fully 90% of the folks who walk into housing court as a renter, tenant person are not represented by an attorney, and the lawyers are always on the side of the
90% of the landlords have lawyers.
Yeah.
And when you go there, they're making deals all out in the hallway.
Right.
And we also did a campaign, our organization, for when tenants go into housing court, that we see the people that run housing court with name tags on, so we'll know who we're talking to other than the landlord who's making a deal with us to put us out. We're making sure that the judge tells us how the court procedure works. We got a TV monitor, both in English and Spanish, to tell the court procedures. We had do a campaign to win that, to get that in all 5 boroughs.
Wow.
Which are all great. They all represent great progress, but still, I mean, people have to be in the courtrooms to even see those
Right.
screens. And many people don't even make it into the courtroom. The security will tell you to wait in the hall, and,
Right.
and an attorney will come and speak to you. And you're not necessarily clear on
Right.
whether that
Who this
attorney is your
attorney is.
attorney,
Right,
a court-appointed
correct.
attorney, or the attorney for the landlord.
Right.
And 90% of the time, it is the attorney for the landlord.
And a lot
like
of
I said.
deals are made in that hallway before you even get in. So
Right.
by the time you get into the judge, it's like, oh, I spoke to a lawyer.
Right.
You didn't hire that lawyer. It could be working for anyone.
Correct.
And then
Exactly.
you go in front of the judge and say, oh, I talked to my lawyer. We have a deal.
Even good deals that are, that you walk out of court that day, like you were saying, deals that seem good on paper because you've avoided eviction may
Right.
mean
Yeah.
that you have to come back and explain why you've signed a contract that you couldn't meet your obligation
a victory
to.
for the day, but it might be a long-term
Exactly.
bad
Absolutely.
thing.
Well, one key point is a tenant needs to know if you don't have a lawyer when you come in there, you can adjourn it to get a lawyer. And most tenants doesn't know that.
Yeah.
You know,
It seems most tenants don't know any of their rights.
correct.
Why would you sort of consider this a civil rights issue?
With criminal cases, you're talking about your life and your livelihood, right? That's why it's a civil rights issue and why defendants are given attorneys. But if you're losing your home and becoming homeless, that's a great risk to your life as well. So it's not sitting behind bars for the rest of your life, but it's certainly setting you back to a place that is very hard to come back from. And people do become homeless out of housing court. A third of homeless intakes are from
Directly.
evictions.
Yeah.
So if you're talking about homelessness, you're talking about housing court. A lot of it begins there.
But
the
then we'll
condition.
also end up talking about the millions of dollars that we spend putting into the shelter system in order to, help the people who are homeless, who we just end up evicting. So on both sides of the argument, there's pros, there's cons, there's actual costs.
Right.
Can we put some numbers to this? How much would it cost to implement this for every person to go in to have a right to counsel? And how would it all also be offset by other costs that the city is already incurring?
Right.
One is, they say, I don't know the figures, it costs anywhere from $100 million to $200 million.
Right.
But to offset the cost is that we spend $3,000 with the people that we have in the shelter system,
Yep.
and to store their property. So to offset that cost is, like my rent now for where I live is $1,495. If I got evicted, you would be paying $3,000 for me to be in that shelter.
So that's the figure that came out. I heard 150 million to 250 million to provide this representation, where we spend about $53 million a year on shelters was another figure that came out. So that's still about $100 million, $200 million that this program will cost. And you're right about those shelter figures. It's about, what, $36,000 a year
Right.
for one shelter bed. So we could, by rights, pay $3,000 a month for every shelter bed and keep people in their apartments. So why is this program to give lawyers to people that would cost us $150 million more advantageous than just paying people's rent flat out?
Well, I'm thinking because it's not sexy. And what I mean by that, I'll qualify that by saying many of the apartments, and specific to the building that I live in here in Clinton Hill, if the landlord is able to get a tenant out, he can quadruple
Right.
the price of that apartment
Yeah.
with doing some very simple renovations. So
there's a threshold that they have to cross.
there is indeed, and as my colleague alluded to, I think that if you could have some greater transparency in court and within the system, and some greater specificity with regard to who you're dealing with and who you could go to for help, I think you would cut down on many of the evictions, many of a lot of the misnomers and misinformation about what the system is like. And as he also stated, signing a stipulation that you're bound to when you don't really have to sign that stipulation if you don't understand or can't afford that. So if you have $2,500 that you have right now, and you sign a stipulation which says, okay, I can pay $5,000 within 5 months, that'll work better for you than it will signing something that you know that you can't follow through on.
Yeah.
Makes sense, but people just get caught up in the moment and they're just trying to get through the day.
And they're emotional and they don't
Yeah,
want to be
absolutely.
evicted.
Right.
And, yeah.
Absolutely.
So who's the enemy of this thing? We saw that the money is one thing, but we've got dozens of council members who are for it, but who's standing on the other side saying, all right, it's cost too much money, we're not
I don't think
doing this.
anybody's really standing up and saying that at this
Yeah.
point, but we're not really seeing it move. So, and because, like you said, there's a focus on affordable housing right now, and there's a very progressive council. It does sort of beg the question, why isn't it moving? And
Yeah.
so I think that part of that is the price tag, and
Yeah.
there's some disagreement over how much it would cost. Not how much it would cost, but how much it would cost in the end when
Yeah.
you take into account the savings.
Right.
So you talked about shelter costs, for instance, but beyond that, proponents of this bill are saying that this will cost in unemployment insurance benefits, that people become unemployed once they're homeless, that there are some longer-term impacts, and that's just an example, but that there are some longer-term impacts that will result in savings in the end. So I think that's the battle that we're going to see happen now, just in terms of dollars and cents.
Well, in terms of dollars and cents, that makes perfect sense. But in terms of time, would this actually create a backlog if they were just sort of adjudicate every case that came before?
Well, that's a good question, but
And
I think we don't.
We already have
obviously,
a backlog as it is.
We don't
so-
know that there are going to be some unintended consequences probably, and that's one that people have thought of. But on the other side of that, how many landlords bring cases to housing court that they know they can't win, but that they can get a stipulation out of somebody, or that they can intimidate a
their goal
tenant?
to win.
So we don't know how those numbers are going to shake out in the end.
We believe it wouldn't create a backlog because most landlords wouldn't take you to court if they know you got a lawyer.
Well,
You'll
Randy,
work that out before you get to the courts, probably.
So looking at the face of this, like going through and reading some of your great reporting and seeing the other stuff, and they tried this in San Francisco, I believe there was a pilot program. This seems like the kind of issue that turns people into Republicans, where they say, you know what, I go to work, I pay my rent, and now we got to devote $250 million to helping people stay in their apartment. Maybe if you can't pay your rent, you have to leave the city. It's not up to us to keep you in your place, and I don't want my tax dollars going to people to get lawyers if they can't pay their rent. So make those people understand why and how this affects them and the fabric of the city, and that they should be investing in it.
Well, I can speak on a small portion of that when it concerns me as a tenant. I didn't go to housing court because I couldn't pay my rent. I went to housing court because my landlord didn't do repairs. Yeah. He was a slumlord. And most of the people that winds up in housing court is either over the heat, painting, they want their apartments painted, the doors that you go in to enter into the buildings are broke.
Yeah.
You have a rat or roach problem that the landlord is not addressing, you understand? And just like this gentleman say, in order to get market value for that apartment, they want you out of there.
Yeah.
So it is not that people are not paying their rent is the reason why they're not in court. These landlords is not doing what they're supposed to do by law for a tenant to be staying in them apartments.
So is this a red herring then? Because we've been told that it's going to help people stay in their apartments and keep them from being evicted. But if most of the issues are about landlords not keeping up with what they're doing or just trying to flip apartments, it's an umbrella. It would provide counsel, but that doesn't necessarily mean that all those cases are about keeping people out of shelters.
Well, that may be true. I mean, the issues that come up in housing court are varied, but the great majority of housing court cases in all boroughs are non-payment cases. So what people actually get brought in for are non-payment cases, and having a lawyer is one way that you would come back with a defense of saying, oh, I have all these repairs that need to be made, and that may have been a pre-existing issue, but tenants generally aren't taking their landlords to court in great numbers. That's just not where the numbers are coming from.
Yeah.
It's probably because they don't have representation. Well, some will argue that this door, opening this door will, sort of lend itself to further lawsuits. So what would sort of an ideal bill look like?
I'm not a legislator, so I don't know that I can say what kind of lawsuits are, what is the concern about lawsuits that you're referring to?
Well, what I'm saying is, it's such a backlog
Okay.
of these things.
Right.
What if people can't get action in a timely fashion? What are their recourses?
Right now.
Right now.
You're saying, oftentimes what happens is, people don't know what to do and they do nothing and they get a default eviction. There is, a room in Bronx Housing Court, I think it's room 230, the order to show cause room that's filled with people usually who didn't know what was going on, hadn't come to court often until they were at that last stop and they got a notice, and now a marshal is involved. And once that order is signed by a judge, the next time they're brought back, there's a sort of case against them. It's like having a prior or something like that.
So what would you guys like to
is the
see
answer.
ideally? Like if you rule the world tomorrow, what would this law look like for the best case scenario for keeping people in their homes?
I'd like to see a lot more of the tenants be informed about what the process is like.
Yeah.
So when people come into housing court, if they got a default motion, as she had said, from the marshal or the sheriff, for them to know that that's not the end of the world. That what you need to do is to go down to court and answer. Anytime that somebody makes a motion, you can answer. And it's just like, oh my God, they're trying to kick us out. It's the end of the world, and it's not necessarily. And then what I've found in the building that I live in, the landlord has refused to take rent from a series of tenants.
Right.
And then
What does that look like? If so you write your check and then it comes back, or they just hold it and don't cash it?
What they're doing is they're sending the checks back because they're saying, okay, we no longer want to have rent stabilized apartments in this building. So what we're going to do is they're going to take our chances within the legal system. So by doing so, they return the checks.
Right.
And when you don't continue to send the checks to them, they bring you to court for what's called a holdover, meaning that you haven't paid your rent. When essentially what they're trying to do is just to get you out of the apartment.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then if you don't have representation,
Right.
then you're going to panic and you may not know what to do. And so what we found here in downtown Brooklyn and in housing court in Brooklyn is that there's kind of been a plethora of that sort of thing.
So do you put the money in escrow then, or you just
do.
keep those canceled checks under your bed and like
But what we are advising people to do is
Right.
to continue to send the checks.
Right.
Yeah.
And to
Just
wait
in good faith every
60
month,
days,
send your check.
and when they don't cash the check, to cancel the check and then take the money and put it into escrow.
Okay.
Because they're not going to, because they're trying to
Right.
find
That's the
a
point. They're trying to get
workaround.
you out.
And just if I may, there's a tenant that lived next door to us that moved out, and they said, okay, well, if you don't restore the cabinets back to the way in which they were before when you moved in, we're not gonna return our deposit to you. And so he put the cabinets up and they ripped them off the wall. And so now that apartment is $5,500 a month.
Oh, that was the repair that
Right.
they justified raising the rent for.
So there was no repair, so he put them back and
Yeah.
then they ripped them off anyway.
It's a dirty business.
Right, very much so.
Well, to that end,
We do have a town hall that we would like to announce tomorrow. I believe we have a flyer we're going to
the Borough President's Office is sponsoring a town hall tomorrow on the subject. It's going to be, of course, at Brooklyn Borough Hall at 6 p.m. tomorrow down at 209 Geralman. You've been to Borough Hall. But all about this tomorrow night, and hopefully it'll keep some folks in their homes from the News You Can Use file.
All right. Well, thank you so
Appreciate
much. We
you
do
guys.
appreciate
Thank
you
you
all.
for
And
having
we want to
us.
see you tomorrow at Borough Hall.